fine. That's fine. You might want to make it big though. So.
And I'm so excited that you all are here for tonight's session. We're going to have the opportunity to hear from Brian Vandenberg about hypnosis. But before we get there, let's make certain that you know a little bit about First Friday Forum, which is an opportunity.
Crystal, can I interrupt for a second? Can you try to mute everybody except
Would you like me to go ahead and do that now?
I think that's a good idea because people sneeze and
right. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. And then Brian, can you verify that you can still unmute yourself? Are you able to do that? Okay, perfect. Just need to make sure we actually can hear from you, because at a certain point, we're not going to want to hear from me anymore. Okay. So today's First Friday Forum, just like all the others, we're coming together to hear from an expert to be able to share of a particular passion or expertise. Brian has prepared a presentation and for a length of time, and then afterwards we're going to have a chance to be able to ask questions of him. We're really glad that you're here tonight to be a part of this experience. We recognize that, well, it's the end of the week, so you need not feel pressure to stay all the way to the very last moment of our conversation. We're glad that you're here for whatever part that you are. And with that, we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian Vandenberg.
Thank you, Crystal. It's great to see everybody. I appreciate your spending Friday evening to come and listen, and I'm delighted to be here. So for 15 years of my career, I was enthralled and befuddled by hypnosis. And I was befuddled because it's such an anomalous, unusual, striking phenomena with startling results. It is a disjuncture, or it's a discontinuous experience from everyday life. So it was also really great entering into the enchantment of hypnosis by studying it and researching it and publishing on it. And also I was enthralled. And the enthrallment comes in part from studying hypnosis brings realization of not simply what makes hypnosis unusual and seemingly bizarre and striking, but that it draws on what goes on in our daily life all the time. So in an ironic way, attending to the unusual nature of hypnosis led to a portal of appreciating the really remarkable and unusual nature of everyday life that we take for granted because we do it habitually and necessarily so, and the ways in which we engage the world and just take everything for granted, or many things for granted. So what hypnosis does is provide a portal into the unusual nature of everyday life. And so that's going to be the aim and the theme of what I'm going to be talking about today. So let me try to share the screen here. So I think of hypnosis as a trickster who for 250 years, which is the time in which hypnosis, it was originally called mesmerism and animal magnetism, have been studied. It's a trickster because every time we've attempted to understand hypnosis, it is mocked joked and danced out of our grasp with a kind of joking mocking of us and our attempts. So this image really, for me, captures the kind of spirit of hypnosis. And it upends fundamental assumptions that we have about ourselves, fundamental assumptions that we use to try to understand ourselves. So we'll be talking about those this evening. And the title of my talk is Unpacking the Mystery of Hypnosis. So I want to give you a visual image of what this 250-year effort to unpack hypnosis looks like. A series of Russian dolls. Every time we unpack hypnosis, what we find is another Russian doll. And I'm not going to be presumptuous enough to presume or to assume that what I'm going to offer tonight is anything other than my own personal Russian doll. So I'm going to start. I want to give you an overview because there are a series of interconnected points, and I want to provide a roadmap for where we're going, how they're connected, and along the way provide signposts. I'm going to be going fast because of time constraints and the enormous amount of information that needs to be covered and also omitted. And there are a large number of off-ramps that we could take that would lead us into some really exotic and very interesting country. I'm going to do everything I can to avoid them. So the first section, what I want to do is talk about what is hypnosis, how is it affected, and what are the effects of hypnosis. And my focus here is going to be that hypnosis is an unusual situation with surprising outcomes and is caused by operations and processes that are operating in everyday life. Then I want to discuss the challenges of fundamental assumptions that hypnosis poses. And again, the surprising outcomes expose the limitations of our thinking about everyday processes. Hang on one second. Okay. About the power of these processes. So again, I want to connect it to everyday life and talk about these challenges and how they really point to the power of what is happening all the time. And then finally, talk about the biological foundations of hypnosis and to underscore that these processes are ever present in part of our adaptive biological heritage. And the point of this third point is to now then return and integrate the first point, what is hypnosis, these processes, and also use it to address the challenges and provide an alternative and maybe more integrative way to think about the fundamental issues and challenges posed by hypnosis. And then I want to provide some brief conclusions for you. So, what is hypnosis? Well, I think it's important to talk about what it is not, because these are assumptions that people have, and it needs to be, when somebody enters hypnosis session, the first order of business is to dispel these false assumptions. It is not sleep. It is not a loss of awareness. It's also not something that in a hypnotic induction, you can work real hard to be hypnotized. Rather, the way in which one becomes hypnotized, it's like a Chinese finger puzzle. So the harder you try, the harder it is to escape. In the case of hypnosis, what one has to do is let it happen, not make it happen. So what it is, it's a deep calm. There is a heightened focus of attention and a reduced peripheral awareness. So it's the narrowing, the outside world blurs and falls away as the tight, attentional, relaxed focus is centered. And when this, and in conjunction with this, is an attentive responsiveness to suggestions. So how is hypnosis induced? Well, the aims of hypnosis include the diminishing of at-the-ready responses, the kind of reflexive responses that we have to the world that we're ready to engage, and to focus and narrow attention to the hypnotist and the hypnotist's voice. So diminish at-the-ready responses, focus, and attenuate critical rational functioning, so that the kind of internal yes, but, and I don't agree, and why is that possible, and so on, we want to diminish that and attenuate that. And in the process, allow the hypnotist a measure of authority over orientation, organization, and interpretation of experience, so that there is a shared regulation of the individual's experiences between the individual and the hypnotist. So there are a number of processes involved that facilitate this. So one is social expectancies and asymmetric authority. So I have here a picture of a physician in his office talking to a mother and her children. So I'm using this as a model for a social situation that is similar to what would be found in the hypnotic situation with an authority, basically, very similar in terms of the setting for a hypnotist and the hypnotic situation. And so here you see a physician wearing a white coat. So why does a physician have to wear a white coat? They really don't have to, but the white coat is a very powerful signal of this person embodies science. What you're getting is the authority of science spoken by the body that is draped in science. There are plaques on the wall that speak to the authority of the individual and underscore that you're in the presence of somebody that you must respect and pay attention to and respond to. Oftentimes there are pictures on the wall of body parts. Most people don't have pictures of body parts hanging around on their walls. The reason why they're here is, again, a signal that this person has spent many years becoming an expert on these body parts and therefore can speak authoritatively to problems that you might be having with your body. So there are situational expectancies and social roles that are signaled by the setting and the attire. When you walk into the office, this is what the situation is. You understand that at a habitual level. It's just assumed this is part of what it means to go to a doctor. So this setting and social roles and authority then allows the physician to control the topics of discourse and the direction of discourse. So it is the physician that directs questions, organizes what's going to proceed, and also offer bizarre requests and expect compliance. So consider this. A physician asks you to disrobe down to your underwear, and you do it. They request, open your mouth. I want to put this stick in your mouth and say, ah, and you do it. And some of the most feared words for men, please bend over and drop your shorts. So if you think about in any other context, somebody asking you to do these things, your response certainly wouldn't be, of course. But in this situation, these really quite remarkable requests, bizarre requests, are done with almost automatic compliance, and it's expected. This is part of the expectation of this setting. So the setting is already establishing, and if you think about hypnosis, this is as bizarre a situation as you can imagine in terms of its difference from, quote, everyday life, but this is part of everyday life because we've learned that this is everyday life, and this is what you do. It's part of your habitual engagement as you proceed through the day. And these are present in everyday social settings and contexts. So I'm highlighting the physician office here. Think about going into a supermarket, for example, and this is true of almost all social settings. If you go into a supermarket and you're wearing your doctor's robe, it doesn't mean you can walk in the produce aisle and start munching on food or juggling cans. Or if you try to leave the store without paying, it is the clerk who has the authority, who can call the police and have you arrested. So your authority in white jacket only works in settings where that's an appropriate signal for that setting of authority. In a supermarket, it's a very different setting with different expectations and authorities. So again, we do this habitually. We don't even notice that this is what's happening. But when you think about the power and the differences that are happening in these settings, it gives an appreciation for just how significant this is, and also how our everyday life is filled with these kinds of really quite remarkable experiences that are invisible to us. Hypnosis makes them visible. Hypnosis is fundamentally about communication, and nonverbal communication is an important part of this. So in the hypnotic context, it's helpful and important to speak in a calm, confident, relaxed, regular, rhythmic pace when involved in the induction process. This hypnotic rhythm communicates non-verbally. You are safe. You do not have to worry. There are no threats. It's okay. Everything's under control. And this is communicated non-verbally at the bodily level through this rhythmic, regular pacing. So also monitoring bodily responses. So it's important in this process to notice, as a hypnotist, it's important to notice eye flutter, nervous gestures and twitches, breathing rate, body posture. These are all giving clues for how the person is syncing up with the process of hypnosis or not syncing up, and what needs to be done and attended to. Also, to coordinate these suggestions with the body. So the request of "you are going deeper," it can be helpful if this request is given as the person is exhaling, so that their body sag in the exhale is being requested or suggesting and mirroring what's being suggested in terms of "you are going deeper." This is, again, the syncing, the nonverbal syncing of suggestions and the body. And the aim is to establish an organic attunement between suggestions and the body. Now, lest you think that this is unusual, and only occurs in hypnosis. Hypnosis is only strategically and intentionally orchestrating in nonverbal communication. This happens all the time in all of our communication. Some of us are a little bit more attuned and better at this than others, but in a conversation, we are responding not just to what's spoken, we're responding to how it's spoken, the body posture and gestures and grimaces or whatever, the way it's received, and we are adjusting our responses accordingly based upon what we're seeing, and the other person is doing the same thing. Social communication involves a dance, a nonverbal dance where people are attuned and responsive to what's going on. Now, again, not everybody is as attuned as others, but nonetheless, this is what's happening all the time, not just in hypnosis. Hypnosis is only using what is already present, using it and orchestrating it to a particular end. Verbal communication is another aspect of the hypnotic situation and involves now the use of words. Elephant. Out of silence, out of nothing, I conjured elephant, the word elephant. And you, in your anticipation, when I said elephant, at least for a moment, you were focused on the meaning of an elephant. I created and conjured an elephant in the room. This is the power of words. Again, we are oblivious to this, but all of our conversations are evoking and creating out of the void something, and the something created by words. So in the Christian New Testament, it is stated that in the beginning was the Word, and meaning that there was a void, there was nothing, and God spoke a word and the world appeared. And this underscores, in a kind of religious framework, but nonetheless underscores what words are in general for all of us. We evoke a world in the use of a word or words out of the void, out of silence. Words, language is a remarkable power. So in the context of hypnosis, this evocative power of words is orchestrated again to, in this case, evoke desired physical experiences. So when a request is made, stare at a spot on the wall, for example, the word stare implies don't blink. So when a person stares and doesn't blink, their eyes get tired or their eyes want to blink. So this sets up a situation where then the suggestion, your eyes are getting heavy, is merely confirming a bodily situation that was set up and evoked by the request. But it gives the understanding that the hypnotist has an understanding of the individual's bodily responses and is suggesting them. Also, typically in the induction stage, it's useful and important to use physically near images. And by that, I mean, rather than asking people to kind of imagine very abstract or distant experiences like pretend you're a jet pilot or whatever, rather imagine yourself lying on the beach and feeling the sun. This is an immediate sensory image that is tied to the body. It's a near image that the suggestion then is speaking to the body. And all responses, especially those contrary, are treated as complying with suggestions. So if you suggest your eyes are getting heavy, they may want to lower. And if the person does not, then you simply say, you can keep your eyes open for as long as you like. So no matter what the actions by the individual, whatever the behavior, it's always in attuned with the expectations and suggestions of the hypnotist. You want to keep this connection and not intentionally focus on division and resistance. Because the point is this co-regulation, getting to this point. So to summarize, verbal and nonverbal communication are interpersonal exchanges that involve process of persuasion and social influence. And this happens all the time. It just is not orchestrated in an intentional way, typically. But it is in a number of important contexts. That is in sales, advertising, propaganda, and social media. These are all venues where the careful, strategic use of verbal and nonverbal communication with an intent to a particular end. So there are individual differences in responsivity. They can be the result of situational factors, and these factors include personal circumstances, what the situation and circumstances is of the individual coming in for hypnosis, the relationship with the hypnotist. That is, there has to be trust, there has to be a relationship of sharing, and if the individual does not feel comfortable and feels something's amiss in this relationship, it's going to really impede hypnotic responsivity and progress. And the motivation of the individual. If somebody's coming in extreme pain, they're going to be much more likely and highly motivated than somebody coming in just to kind of check it out and maybe demonstrate that they can't be hypnotized. So important situational factors, and this underscores that this process is a negotiation. It's not a Svengali-like control by the hypnotist over the helpless individual who comes in and must submit to the will of the hypnotist. There are also stable characteristics. And contrary to popular opinion, these stable characteristics are not gullibility, they're not lack of intelligence, and it's not related to a lack of capacity for critical thought. What it is related to is the propensity for absorption in stories, movies, and books, etc. That is, when you think about being absorbed in a book, the rest of the world falls away. You become absorbed, engrossed, and individuals that become very absorbed to the exclusion of the rest of the world in these kinds of imaginary involvements also typically or are more likely to be more hypnotically responsive, because if you remember, going back to what we talked about, what hypnosis is, it is this narrowing of attention, the periphery falls away in an intense focus. So hypnotic effects, I'm sure you're aware of many of them. I'll give a few, and all of them are remarkable in some ways, in many ways. This is what draws us to hypnosis. It draws me to hypnosis. It's like, are you kidding me? How is this possible? These effects include non-volition. And for many, this is considered almost the definition or a definitional feature of hypnosis, is the experience of non-volition. The experience, so typically, everyday life, we have the sense that we are captains of our ship, that we are in control of our actions, and what we do is because we will it and we make it happen. in hypnosis, there is the experience of it is happening to me. I'm not making it happen. It is happening. And it's tied to the suggestions that are being offered. Amnesia is another. That is, in the hypnotic situation, a request could be made that you will not remember what occurred in the hypnotic situation, then post-hypnosis. It's not remembered. So how could something very significant only a few moments ago be forgotten, and apparently intentionally so, which is almost the definition of not forgetting? So again, this kind of paradoxical, you have this kind of separation of consciousness where you have both awareness and non-awareness. And this is certainly true in perceptual alteration. Perceptual alteration occurs, for example, when a suggestion is made that the chair that's there, you don't see. And so then if you ask the individual, is there a chair in the room? They will say no, because they report that they don't see it. But if you ask the individual to walk around the room, they will walk around the room but avoid the chair, clearly seeing that the chair is there, but reporting that the chair is not. So this is called translogic. It defies logic, but it's the logic of trance. And just as a footnote, this was used with Ted Bundy, the Hillside Strangler, to see if he was shamming hypnosis. They were using hypnosis with him, and Ted walked into the chair, which was a very good indication that he was shamming being hypnotized. So hypnosis effects also include quite remarkable physical and medical responses. Major surgery being performed without pain, amputations, removals of gigantic tumors, again, without the individual feeling pain. The treatment and cure of skin disorders, some of which are considered incurable, post-surgery recovery, so faster recovery and blood loss from surgery, quicker discharge, and also used in chemotherapy to help people with nausea and vomiting. So the challenges to fundamental assumptions, and I think you can kind of intuit what they are as we're talking here. They involve, and these assumptions are central assumptions that we use and be starting points for understanding ourselves. And so one assumption is the separation of mind and body, the relationship of mind and body. Another is we have assumptions about the nature of mind, and we also have assumptions about the relationship between self and other. So the first one, mind and body. You can see here the two separate circles, they do not overlap. The typical assumption is that the causal direction is from body to mind. It is always the body, some material force or cause that affects the mind. The reverse, that the mind can have profound effects on the body, has been for 250 years been dismissed as a legitimate causal pathway. So, examples. The cause of hypnosis. So when hypnosis first appeared as mesmerism and animal magnetism 250 years ago, and again, the issue was what causes these quite remarkable effects? It must be material. It must be a material cause of some kind. And what was argued by Mesmer is that it is caused by animal magnetism. Animal magnetism, in his theory, was like magnetism and electricity, these invisible forces that we can't see, but nonetheless exert enormous power on our lives. And so he argued that's what, and he was able to manage and use these forces to affect these results. So a commission headed by Benjamin Franklin, and this in itself is one of those off-ramps that I would love to go to, but can't, was appointed by the King of France. They did experiments, including the first double-blind experiments in the use of placebo controls. And they concluded that there's no such thing as animal magnetism. There is not a physical substance. What the effects were caused by imagination and expectation. And this was the reason for dismissing it as a legitimate concept. Mesmerized was discredited and driven out of Paris because it was considered to be a sham, because they demonstrated that it was imagination and expectation. 100 years later, the most eminent neurologist in France, Charcot, argued that no, the cause was neurological, that there were neurological reasons that explained the phenomena of hypnosis. That also was disproven and again demonstrated that the cause was imagination and expectation. And not only was Charcot discredited, that was the end of physicians studying hypnosis as a medical phenomena. And to this day, hypnosis has it is under great suspect by the medical community because there's no obvious material bodily cause that can be pointed to. So other phenomena who share this similar history, hysteria and shell shock. Hysteria and shell shock were, again, right at the turn of the 20th century, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century with World War I, were thought to be caused by, in the case of hysteria, it's another off-ramp, but among other things, it was a neurological condition. And shell shock, the name comes from the percussive shock of shells. It was thought that this percussive shock is what caused these really very debilitating experiences. And with research, it was shown not to be a physical cause, but a psychological trauma cause. And one of the things that happened then is that, well, I'll get to that. So that was what causes hypnosis. What about the effects of hypnosis? This is equally startling because now we're talking about the effects of talk, of mental. This is not a physics, biology, chemistry cause. This is talk or mental on the body. So we've talked about some of these effects. So what's going on here? And to underscore this, the treatment of hysteria and shell shock, which were really debilitating, and I was going to show you some clips, I didn't have time, of what this looks like or did look like. And it was treated by hypnosis and effectively treated. This in World War II and World War I in particular, great cures were made with people who couldn't walk because of shell shock by hypnosis. And eventually what happened is hysteria, shell shock, and others became subsumed as their physical cause was not identified, but in fact not there, was subsumed under mental illness, another off-ramp that I'm going to avoid, It was subsumed under mental illness, and the treatment of it was not hypnosis, led to a more general treatment of psychotherapy. And also in terms of the effects of mind on body, as I mentioned, the powerful effects of hypnosis for the amelioration of pain, skin disorders, post-surgery and chemotherapy. Again, inexplicable and remarkable consequences as a result of a simple conversation. A related phenomena is the placebo. So when you think about the placebo is used in now almost all medical trials as a control condition along with a no treatment condition against which a active medical, it could be medication or other kind of medical treatment is compared. And one of the really quite remarkable things is many of these trials, what the evidence shows is the placebo is as effective, if sometimes not more effective, than the NOA treatment and the medical treatment that is being tested. So you would think, why isn't somebody asking, what? How do we explain this placebo? This is a remarkable effect where across any number of medical kinds of trials, it's oftentimes as powerful as the medicine that, or the treatment that we're investigating. It has no side effects and it cuts across the whole domain. And it has been virtually ignored because it is used to dismiss the treatment, but also with it, placebo is dismissed as a legitimate causal factor because it does not fit into the body influences mind only. But I will note that about the last 15 years, there's been an increase. There's been the beginnings of important research on the placebo. And just a little tidbit, they have found that even if you tell people it's a placebo, it works. And apparently, blue pills are more effective than other colored pills. So the nature of mind. Again, the remarkable effects of hypnosis point to our mental capacities for dissociation, of compartmentalizing so profoundly that in one frame, we can report that there's no chair, and in another frame, we walk around it because we see it's there. We have dissociated and compartmentalized. Also, the power of unconscious factors on our thought and action that we're completely unaware of, and underscoring that in a very fundamental and profound way, our mind is non-logical. Self-other, another one. So we, and especially in the United States, have this view of the self as a citadel, sitting on a hill surrounded by a moat, and the ruler is inside the citadel and the social world is out there. There's a really stark separation. And what communication consists of is sending messages out the letter slot and then receiving messages in the letter slot, so that it's these various citadels sending messages back and forth through the slot. And also, when we talk about culture, this is like has no referent at all. There's not anything you can point to and say there's culture in a material way. So, and we'll get to the culture thing in a bit. So hypnosis undermines this idea of the kind of sanctity and the citadel of the self by underscoring through the experience of non-volition, and non-volition that happens in the matter of a brief conversation, and is part of the interpersonal exchange that alters basic biological and intrapsychic function. This quasi-Venn diagram underscores that, if you remember, the two separate, they are not separate, they're overlapping in very significant and interpenetrating ways. So the biological foundations. So again here, I want to use this now to link up, to connect with the everyday experiences. Excuse me. The everyday processes that are operating in hypnosis, and also then use this when we talk about these biological foundations to rethink ourselves and reconsider then these challenges that hypnosis poses to our fundamental assumptions. So one of the most biologically compelling features of our adaptation is that we are woefully helpless, woefully incapable at birth of sustaining life on our own for any length of time. So this profound helplessness necessarily carries with it consequences. We require caregivers for many, many years. And this doesn't imply, it dictates that we are a social species. We are necessarily social and must be so if we're going to survive. And the caregiver, another name for asymmetric authority, is the one who takes care of everything and is the authority for very basic, fundamental caring for ourselves. So the caregiver in this situation with a helpless infant, there are things that a caregiver must do if this infant's going to survive. They must feed, clothe, move, clean, and protect. This stuff sounds obvious, but when you think about what this means for the social self-other and the regulation of the body, the caregiver must engage and communicate non-verbally. There has to be a connection if this baby is going to survive. And the caregiver must alleviate distress, discomfort, and pain. And one of the typical ways of doing this is through soothing, rocking, stroking, singing in a regular hypnotic rhythm. And what we talked about in hypnosis for this regular rhythm being communicated non-verbally is exactly the same thing that's being communicated to this infant. You're safe. Don't worry. Everything's under control. And profoundly, as I mentioned, involves asymmetric authority, and non-verbal communication organizes the body. So this is not, when we see this in hypnosis, it's just a particular manifestation of what is there as part of our biological heritage. So the infant also, in this context, has some things that it must do, or he and she must do, if it's going to survive. It must be attuned to the caregiver. This is the vital source of staying alive. And this is biologically hardwired. So infants from birth, their vision is attuned and orients toward the human eyes. And the human eyes at a particular fairly close level, or I'm sorry, distance. Come close, and the use of the eyes engages the caregiver. This is eyes engage. at birth or shortly thereafter, infants can discriminate the smell of their mother from others. And infants' hearing is attuned to not just the human voice, but to the range of the female voice. Infants also must be able to communicate, express their needs if they're going to get them met. And the needs are many. And they do this vocally, screeches, screams, cry, cooing, and other verbal ways of stating. And what's critical here is it isn't that the infant's saying, oh, I think I'm hungry, I think I'll cry. There's not a gap here. It's the body experiencing hunger and expressing it. There's a direct connection between the body, the biological needs, and the body's expression of it, which is also a communicative gesture about its state that is understood by the caregivers. So the body is both experiencing and expressing at the same time, vocally through body postures and gestures, eye movement and eye gaze. All of these are communicating at the nonverbal level as a way of engaging and expressing their needs to the caregiver. So the body is an instrument of social meaning. It is not a separate biological over here and social over here, or meaning over here. The body is an instrument of social meaning. Mind is embodied, and body is minded. And in a very profound way, self and other interpenetrate. Another feature of human adaptation that's essential if a baby, an individual, is going to enter into the community and communication with others beyond simple gestures now, but entering into a more sophisticated and existing community is through the use of language. And we talked about the power of language early on when we talked about the use of verbal communication in hypnosis. So language is used to engage and influence via verbal communication. Obvious, but one of the features of this that is also obvious but taken for granted and not usually appreciated is that language cuts across biological, interpersonal, and cultural. Our brain is wired to acquire and use language. In the language, the biological nature of this is to facilitate our social engagement with others. The self is necessarily needs to be engaged and connected and involved with others, and it's organized at the bodily level. And words are cultural forms of meaning. When you try to learn another language as an adult, you discover that these are just abstract sounds. They don't have any meaning. You have to learn. And these words exist before and beyond any one of us. They exist out there as a collective meaning that's embedded in language. So when I mentioned before about cultural seeming abstract, it is not abstract. We use it all the time. Indeed, we speak through cultural forms of meaning. And culture is literally embodied in the individual through language. And the body is enculturated through language and by the use of language. And obviously, mind influences the body. When we talk, when somebody says something that makes us very angry, a word is provoking an enormous biological response. And every other response that you can think of that words can evoke underscore that the mind, in this case, language, meaning, has profound effects on the body. So, to summarize, the biological foundations in the hypnotic process are part of the biological foundations of everyday life and adaptation. Asymmetric authority and nonverbal and verbal communicative attunement between the self and other is an adaptive necessity. And that's with regard to the hypnotic processes that are the everyday processes. And number 2 on the list, fundamental challenges. Again, the biological foundations underscore that mind, body, self, other are all interconnected and must be so for our individual and collective survival. So, to conclude, hypnosis exposes the power of the processes in everyday life. Remarkable, remarkable power that we take for granted habitually and have been habituated so that we just motor through and take for granted. And what hypnosis does, by its being unusual, is it spotlights the power of these processes that are going on in a hidden way in everyday life. Hypnosis reveals our lack of understanding of ourselves. The mystery of hypnosis is us. And everyday life, not hypnosis, is the trickster. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you, Brian, so very much. Everybody's muted, but you can see that they're applauding you loudly, so to speak. We have some questions that popped up in the chat, but I also want to make certain that all of you out there are able to unmute yourselves to be able to ask a question as well. So, Brian, are you willing to take the first question?
No, I look forward to this.
All right, so Jane Schaefer sent this one a little bit earlier, and when we had the example of the asymmetric or demonstration in the doctor's office. So you had an image there, and the question was, is it appropriate for this woman to be bringing children to a session?
Well, I'm assuming it was a pediatrician. So, I mean, I don't know.
Right, so not necessarily an image of a doctor to, like a hypnotist to in a session in that particular image.
So my point was that what happens typically in a doctor's office in terms of the expectations is analogous to what happens in the hypnotic situation. And I picked that image because I thought it was a really good graphic example of the physician's office that had children. And so it isn't that this is exactly what happens in hypnosis. It was more a way to use a example of a medical context of a physician to then draw the parallel to the hypnotic situation. Not that it's the same thing, but it bears on the same kind of situational expectancies and social roles, not unlike what's found with a physician. I don't know if that helps.
I think that I appreciate that clarification. Katie, do you have a question?
I do. Hi, Brian and Sharon. Good to see you guys. So I am curious about the relationship between hypnosis and meditation, which I think Ron and Sue are asking about as well. So we know that meditation is used to treat things like chronic pain, and so is hypnosis. There was a set of case studies I read a while back where people who didn't respond well to meditation actually had better luck with hypnosis. So I'm curious about whether you think those states of consciousness are fundamentally different in terms of hypnosis versus meditation.
That's a great question. I'm going to give you a uninformed answer. And is this, when we talk about mental states, and first of all, the hypnotic trance is, and this is controversial, but it can be greater or lesser for different people. But the situational context also influences what the mental experience is going to be and what the expectations are. So while I think there is some overlap in terms of the kind of psychological experiences, I also think that they're different in terms of the kind of expectations in a hypnotic situation that might bear on this. And I don't know if Don is waving his hand, but so that's my take, is that there is an overlap, but they're not identical. Yeah, but there is a similarity, but they're not the same thing.
That works. Thank you.
Right, so we have a lot of questions in the chat. I know that folks here have their hands up, so we're just going to go back and forth. So one of the folks, Maxine, is just like, can you tell us about hypnosis in everyday life? So do you have an example? I know that you talked specifically about like how folks might ameliorate pain through hypnosis, but are there instances like
That's not what I meant. I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead. Tell
Just
exactly what
everyday life. How is hypnosis affecting us in everyday life? Advertising, going to the grocery store, walking down the street, everyday life.
So my point is not that we're hypnotized in everyday life. And I'm sorry if this is not clear because it's an essential point. What I'm saying is that hypnosis offers a, if you will, a little test tube of how these forces that are operating in everyday life can, in this unique situation, have really remarkable effects. So in everyday life, for example, people go into different settings and have completely different experiences because of their expectations in response to this setting and the people that are there. The point is not that they're hypnotized as much as it is that we see these situations as given. We go to the grocery store. What's so unusual about this? Well, what's unusual about it is the whole thing has been structured by a set of social expectations and roles that really cause us to and creates responses in us that we take for granted, but it was a result of these processes that also operating in hypnosis. Not that so there are different situations, have different sets of expectations, different sets of expected outcomes and social roles. But a store clerk in a grocery store is not hypnotizing people. They are using their authority in that setting in ways that are appropriate for that setting, but are quite remarkable that And, you know, when you think about, here's somebody that in the general social class has low authority, but yet they can have somebody arrested. So it's the shift. I don't know if this is really a critical point, Maxine. So if it's not clear, I need to keep talking. I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I said whatever works for you. I don't think I had an answer, but that's okay.
Well, I'm a little worried that this is not clear.
No, I know there's authority and there's psychology, but hypnosis in everyday life is different than authority and psychology. So I was just wondering
So,
how, what's
okay,
going
let
on
me keep
with
talking.
hypnosis. Yeah.
So I'm saying that hypnosis, in a loose sense, is created by the social expectancies and roles and asymmetric authority and all the rest of this in that situation. And they are unique sets of expectations about hypnosis that don't apply in a grocery store. So and as we go through different social contexts, social settings, there are a different set of roles and expectations that evoke and carry different kinds of expectations for what our experience will be. So we're not being hypnotized in the grocery store, but the hypnosis process is built on the same underlying processes that give rise to our other social settings and contexts.
Do you mean like social influence?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I know Kelsey, I want to make sure Kelsey gets
Yeah.
a chance to.
Hey, so sort of a little bit different, but the way that I'm sort of conceptualizing hypnosis is almost like in this odd sort of like non-category between like anti-meditation and like biofeedback and like this conversion like type of process, but also, or I guess like an anti-conversion type of process. But also like how do you see it fit into the framework of like a psychoanalytic framework?
So I have, this is going to get me in a lot of trouble, but I have great sympathy for the psychoanalytic framework. I mean, you know, so let me back up. I think the best explanation and understanding of hypnosis was provided by a guy by the name of Genet, who is a contemporary with Freud, who argued much of the same thing as Freud, only more accurate and not with all of the extra baggage about id, ego, and all the rest of this. So, but I do think Freud got a lot of this right. So his explanation of hypnosis makes considerable sense to me. So how does it fit into a psychoanalytic framework? I think okay, so there have been two schools of approach to trying to understand hypnosis generally. One has been focused on the internal states of dissociation, and the other has been focused on the external states of social influence. And they have been fighting for 100 years. And it's only recently that people started to say, hey, you know what? It's both. So the psychoanalytic framework has emphasized the importance of the dissociative internal. And I think they got a fair amount of that right. And certainly Genet got an awful lot of it right. What they didn't incorporate in really a full form is the social situational factors that is largely ignored. but I will say, I think, some of this regression and so on that they talk about, and this gets complicated, but I think there's some, I'm sympathetic to it. I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Does that mean I answered your question?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
So Ron and Sue and Anne and Melody have a question that sort of connects together. So I'm going to connect a few of them. Ron and Sue Williams are asking, what's the relationship between hypnosis and biofeedback? And then someone as a follow-up is whether hypnosis has been used to stop smoking or control eating disorders, or like help folks stop with addictions of any sort.
So I'll answer the second question first. Yes, it has been used. And one of the things that we've discovered is that for the treatment of many of these things, it's not a miracle cure. For example, at least my understanding of, and I've been out of the literature for 15 or 20 years, so things could have changed very radically in that time. But the last I was aware of, the success rate for treating smoking with hypnosis was not significantly different than other very successful treatments. And that's true for a lot of these phenomena. One of the problems and one of the reasons why they move from hypnosis to psychotherapy is because there are a fair number of people who are not hypnotically responsive. So they then become not easily treated in hypnosis. So hypnosis is not a panacea. In terms of the biofeedback, again, if we think about just, is the mind capable of influencing the body? Absolutely. Hypnosis involves a particular pathway or an example of the ways in which, a way in which the mind, in this case, and it's in conjunction with social expectations, can powerfully influence the body. So I see biofeedback as an example of mental awareness of one's biological situation that allows one to use that feedback to regulate and respond to bodily situations. I don't think it's the same thing as hypnosis, but it involves a more general process of the ways in which, and this is maybe an aside, maybe not, but there's a phenomenon called biolooping. And biolooping means that it's a loop between mind and body. It's not like one and then the other. One influences the other, which influences one, and they're connected. And this gets into another cul-de-sac. But so I think the answer is that it's part of a more general process of biolooping, and it's one instance of it. And there are many different forms in which that biolooping can occur. That is, the body influencing the mind and the mind influencing the body. Hypnosis is one social context that has certain kinds of expectations and processes. And there are others that overlap to a greater or lesser extent with this, but they're all the ones that you're mentioning, they're all partaking of this biolooping and coming at it in different ways. I hope, I'm a little concerned that I've created confusion rather than clarity here.
Brian, that was very good. I understand exactly what you're saying.
Good, thank you.
Claude, Joan, do you have a question you want to share?
Yeah, so I was interested in this, idea that you could tell the person that the chair isn't there and they wouldn't consciously see it, but other part of the brain knew it was there. So I'm curious, suppose in the case of somebody being hypnotized to not feel pain in some situation like surgery or something. Are the physiological consequences of the pain still present in the body, even though they don't consciously feel the pain? Or is it actually as if there's plane is completely blocked, or does it vary?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer. And here's another example that probably doesn't answer the question, but kind of speaks to it indirectly or in a different way. So if you had the good fortune of hearing Don Beers's talk about dissociative identity disorder, which was fabulous, by the way, and Don is a very experienced hypnotist. He's had many, many years using hypnosis and not only in terms of treating, but training. And there's a very close connection between dissociative identity disorders and hypnosis, historically and even in terms of treatment. So I don't know if this will answer your question. I don't know the direct answer to your question, but so when Don talked about some of the examples of dissociative identity disorder, and this is, again, we're talking about this separation, right? So he gave one example that I remember of these dissociative identities, where one identity was deathly allergic to oranges and would go into a allergic shock eating an orange. The other identity was not allergic to oranges at all. There was another example that he gave of, again, this dissociative split, where one identity was addicted to heroin. The other identity was not. And for me, these are just phenomenal examples of what the hell is going on. So I don't know. I'm sure people have looked at this, but in terms of and this is a cul-de-sac that I'm going to try to not go too deeply down, but one of the great things, and it is related to this. So when hypnosis, this is in the 1830s and 40s, was being used for surgery for amputations and other major surgery. And remember, this is at a time when they did not have anesthetics. And the medical community, which legitimately was worried about all of the kind of spiritualism that was present at the day, but they dismissed these surgeries as the person was shamming. When you think about that, that's rather bizarre. That shamming could have this kind of effect, which is an admission of the power of mind. But then they also said the behavioral manifestations of pain were quite minor and would occasionally involve a kind of rustling or movement, or and so they said, well, see, there is something going on here. It's not working. Of course, the person had surgery and didn't have any of the responses that is typically associated when you're cutting somebody's leg off. So I don't know if that addresses your question either, but it speaks to the kind of experiences that people are having in a very manifest behavioral way. And so here's part of the irony is then when they started using ether, which was at the time a party drug, that the medical community said, we've got to find something physical, medical here that can match hypnosis, and then dismiss hypnosis, which is exactly what happened. Under those circumstances, the patients displayed the same result, the same behavioral manifestations. And they said, oh, that's just proof that they're under anesthetic. And by the way, one of the unfortunate side effects of the use of ether early on was the unfortunate side effect of death. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know.
No, but that helps a lot. That's really nice. Thank you.
There are 2 questions in the chat about self-hypnosis. So I'm wondering if you could talk, is self-hypnosis possible? Is meditation a form of self-hypnosis? Like how can that come to be?
Yeah, so when I received training and went to training, got certified, and I was really, and I had the opportunity of being hypnotized as part of a demonstration, and it was absolutely fabulous. My experience of it was just so terrific. And so I wanted to continue being able to do that. So I trained myself in self-hypnosis, and I would practice it daily. And so the experience, my experience of being hypnotized was not unlike a mind-altering drug experience in terms of the experience of it. And so, is it a drug experience? No. So the self-hypnosis, yes, it's possible. It is, and part of why I want to kind of train myself is if I ever needed to be able to do this, I wanted to be able to do this. And it was through the process of what I found that was involved, it was almost like having to find that mental space or place of that experience. It's almost like it's hard to explain, but it's a zone, or it's learning how to find that zone. And so that's what self-hypnosis was. Is it like meditation? Well, so I meditate every day for 10 minutes, and I would not say what I do is anything related to this. And part of it is because I'm so horrible at this so when you talk about people that are experts at this, that, can sit on logs that are on fire and so on, I don't know. But again, it speaks to the same kind of thing we were talking before. All of these phenomena partake of this feature of the capacity, the remarkable capacity for mind to influence body. And there are different ways in which this can be affected and evoked to have particular kinds of responses. Now, and I'm sure there's been, well, as a matter of fact, right before I retired, they just, all right, this is a cul-de-sac, sorry, but I'm sure somebody has looked at it. I don't know the answer. And I think also it's important to think about the social context sets up a set of expectations, and these expectations include expectations for the way in which our mind is going to be engaged. So our mind is constantly being organized by the social context and expectations. So there might be situations where, so let me back up. So there's been a lot of debate about are things like religious trance states and Sufi, what are the Sufi dancers? Anyway, is that hypnosis? So my answer is yes and no. They are different cultural ways of experiencing some really transformational and remarkable experiences of the mind on the body that are organized by certain sets of cultural expectations. So there is a family resemblance across all of these things. But if you, and it gets into a definitional term also, but if you want to say, is it hypnosis? Well, no, because there are different expectancies in hypnosis than there are in some of these other things, but they share a family overlap. And maybe to make it more confusing, which I'm worried that I'm doing, the experience of hypnosis has changed historically. So what is typically experienced in hypnosis now was not typical in the mid-19th century. The range of what was experienced under what was then called mesmerism was enormous. And it was part of the social, cultural context of expectations for what happens in this social situation and setting. And again, this underscores the power of these expectancies that I'm talking about to shape our very experience. So even hypnosis itself has changed historically. So if you say, is the experience in the 19th century the same as in the 20th century? Well, yes and no, because there is this common feature of the ways in which the social expectations create this very intense and with certain characteristics that overlap, but there's also the differences. So yes and no. I'm sorry. I'm afraid that I'm not helping here, but it reflects my state of confusion also. So if that's of any help.
So Eleanor had a question, which I think is tangential to what you've already discussed. And she is asking whether Christian scientists use a version or an offshoot of hypnosis themselves. And I don't know if you can speak to that specifically.
Yes. So one of the off-ramps on this has been the whole history of hypnosis. And one of the off-ramps is Christian Science. So Mary Baker Eddy, is that the name of the person that started Christian Science? Yeah. So she became a very strong practitioner and advocate. This is in the 1840s or 50s, something like that, of what was then called mesmerism and animal magnetism, and was taken by this incredible power of the mind on the body, and arguing that this has, been validated by science. So so this is controversial, but Christian Science and the founding of Christian Science comes out of her experience with hypnosis, or what was then called mesmerism and animal magnetism. And was deeply influenced by it. However, once it was established and beginning to establish, she repudiated any connection to this because, of course, animal magnetism and mesmerism was on the fringes of what was accepted. So I'm reading in motivation to her. But so yes, it was very directly influenced and partakes of it in very significant historical and founding ways that is quite fascinating. I mean, the history of hypnosis, from the discovery and invention of anesthesia to Benjamin Franklin, the Franklin Commission, the first use of double-blind experiments and placebo. That was 250 years ago. That now is standard procedure. That was the first time it was used. There's a whole history of the psychotherapy. I mean, it just goes on and on in terms of the kind of, all of these are a reflection of attempts to try to capture the trickster who always eludes capture, but leaves behind these incredible kinds of developments and consequences that are fascinating and fabulous. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it's certainly added perspective and historical background, so thank you. I think we have time to just do one more. And you had mentioned that you were interested in hypnosis, and so you did some training and some credentialing. And Judy Kolchiski is wondering what kind of training is involved in being a hypnotist, what kind of credentialing occurs, and if you could speak to that as our last question.
Yeah, I can speak, and I'm going to defer to Don Beers on this, but so for me, it was a weekend training. And one of the things I took from that training was I was woefully unprepared to deal with the ways in which things can go very wrong and very sideways. So I never used it, and that was not my emphasis, but I never used it in clinical practice. I felt that if anybody is to do this, they need more than a weekend of training. They need to be supervised over time to know the ins and outs, and things can go wrong. And you've got to be experienced. And I personally did not want that responsibility and did not want to go through the training, and I didn't do enough practice to even was interested in it. My interest was largely in some of these issues that I've talked about. So I'm sure Don Beers can speak.
Yeah, I can, Brian, yes. There are levels of certification depending on the organization you're in, but I believe, and there are some states that have a requirement for certification in order to use hypnosis in practice.
Right.
But I think that's a state-by-state set of credentialing. At the point that I was getting that training, I believe anybody could do hypnosis so long as they were doing hypnotherapy. I mean, therapy. And you could just sort of fold hypnotherapy into it. So your observations are well taken. But one of the comments I would like to make is, having done hypnotherapy for, my God, it's like 50 years in various different levels of practice. I learned stuff from your presentation, and I don't think listeners would appreciate some of the perceptiveness of some of the things you were saying about the biological roots of this, about the social context, how it goes into our relationships with culture and with individuals, the role of authority and power, and how that influences what happens communicatively. And so I was incredibly impressed by the profundity of what you were saying in terms of understanding hypnosis. So I learned something from it. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. Coming from you, who's really an expert on this, I take that with
Yeah,
great
really good. Really good. Thanks.
Can we give Brian another round of applause for this evening's presentation?
Thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to revisit what has been an enthralled befuddlement for me for many years.
Enthralled. I like that. That's great.
We appreciate so much your time. Thank you for sharing this passion and expertise with us. And I appreciate that all of you were here to be able to participate. Our next First Friday Forum will be in May. And I confess, I don't remember what the presentation is, but Carol Beer probably does.
It's Brian Schutz talking about nature photography. And then Bradley, what did I say? Oh, no, Brian Vandenberg. Bradley Schutz talking about nature photography. And then the virtual travel club is 2 weeks from tonight. And the topic is Berlin, Germany.
And we hope to see you there for both in this particular Zoom room. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you.
Bravo, Brian.
Bravo, Brian, indeed.
Bye.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Wonderful talk. It really
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Very interesting.
Great.
Crystal, remember to stop the recording.